What we have next, from the Turf Sprint to the Breeders, the Grey Goose. Let's get the sponsor in there. The Grey Goose Breeders Cup Juvenile. There you see the lineup. 11 horses were pre-entered. Madman Diaries, the speedster, going around 2 turns for the first time somewhere, has first preference in the juvenile turf that we just talked about. So Madman Diaries not expected to run here. The other 10 are expected to run. Accomplishment-wise, it's a good field. The 5 Grade 1 winners are all in here. The 5 races in America that are Grade 1 prep races for the Breeders' Cup, the winner of those 5 races, for the first time maybe, in the Breeders' Cup in the Grey Goose Juvenile, a mile and a 16th. Now, I've got a little bit of a different approach here. I try to stay away from hype as much as I can. And to me, Uncle Mo and Boys at Toscanova, who have certainly looked good in the races that we've seen so far, are also heavily hyped, more so than perhaps their accomplishments would warrant. Therefore, in my top 5, you're going to see something that I usually don't do. I usually don't go for horses off of synthetic to dirt that are come from behinders, because those horses typically are favored by synthetics and not as much on dirt. But here you've got Jaycito, the Mike Mitchell trained horse who comes off a win in the Norfolk, who was wide around both turns, 4 wide around both turns. So you look at that 88 speed figure that he had, and you can pretty realistically bounce it up to a 94 or a 95, which would put him at about the same level as Boys at Toscanova was in the Hopeful and Uncle Mo was in the Juvenile. With Boys in Toscanova and Uncle Mo, you don't know if they're going to be as effective around 2 turns as they are around 1 turn. You don't know how much the pace scenario might work against them. Uncle Mo's never been behind another horse in his 2 races. Boys at Toscanova was sprinting in the Hopeful. See, there are enough question marks to me about the 2 New York-based horses that Dutrow and Todd Pletcher have, that Jaycito could be able to mow them down in a pretty lively paced race perhaps, and at a much better price.
And I think we have the Champagne Stakes here to take a look at Uncle Mo. He was dogged throughout the early portions of this race. The Champagne will be with us moment. Here we go. By this time, Uncle Mo has shaken off some early pace pressure from a horse who was right alongside him. And what did you think of the stretch run, Randy? I couldn't tell if he was getting a little ragged right there. It might just be greenness. What did you think of his stretch run?
I thought he was maybe slightly green, but you know, I preferred as I was even watching this race, viewing the race in context of who was behind him, which was very little. I mean, this was more or less, to my eyes, a glorified breeze in a Grade 1 race, which you certainly don't see very often, especially in the Champagne. I would have preferred, from a Breeders' Cup Juvenile perspective, to have seen some other horses in there and that of quality, and to have seen Uncle Mo maybe sitting behind horses, which I'm sure Todd Pletcher would like to have seen as well. But when you're in a situation that he was in the Champagne, with horses that he was running against, you don't want to mess around. Just let the horse do what he likes to do, and don't try to get too creative and take your $500,000 winner's share, whatever the purse was for the Champagne, and then move on. But it's very likely that, or at least it's about a coin flip here, that he's going to be in a position, depending on post position, where he might have to sit behind another horse. Now, I don't know who that might be. Boys at Toscanova, if he draws the rail, let's say, they might want to go with him.
I think Uncle Mo's going to have the lead if he wants it. And one thing you know is that Pletcher is not going to allow Stay Thirsty to duel with Uncle Mo. What do you? I know you liked Rogue Romance a lot. His run in the Bourbon Stakes, which was on grass. It looks like he's going to run in this race on dirt, which Kenny McPeek has been wont to do on occasion, is to take his good grass horses and run them on dirt. Mm-hmm. Would you have run this horse in this spot, or would you have taken him back to the grass?
I would have run him on the grass, simply because the competition in American racing is, although you've got the Europeans to deal with, but the competition is typically over here easier on the grass than it is on dirt, especially when you're talking about the Breeders' Cup Juvenile as opposed to the turf juvenile, or the juvenile turf. Rogue Romance, you know, he was very visually impressive in that win in the Bourbon, because if you were watching the ESPN telecast, it was a, you know, carried away with it, maybe, perhaps a little bit. But when he left the starting gate, he got squeezed around a little bit and had to steady. And I mentioned the sand on the Keeneland turf course, the sand-based turf course. They were kicking up so much sand in the horse's face that he was literally very much resenting it, throwing his head in the air, trying to climb over the top of the dirt. Leparoux moved him inside, moved him outside to try to get him out of the shower of dirt. It wasn't working. He was getting it anyway. Even almost all the way around the turn, he was still fighting the dirt, hitting him in the face. And I stopped watching it at that point. I thought, well, this horse has no shot. And then I didn't pick him up again until about the 3/16 pole when I saw him motoring on the outside, and I couldn't believe that he was actually, going to be that impressive. But see, now you're talking about with that race that he came out of, and that reaction to sand hitting him in the face. What's going to be hitting him in the face here?
Right, that's a good point. One I hadn't considered. So
I mean, he's in the same sort of scenario, if not worse, running on dirt than he was running on grass in the Bourbon. So. Personally, I would have run him in the other race, but he's also bred to be a dirt horse. He's by Smarty Jones out of a fleet mare. He's not bred for grass at all.
I found the Smarty Joneses, in theory, not bred for grass. In practice, I found they've done better on grass than on dirt, but I may be mistaken. But a Fleet Alex Forever is asking online if you think if this race was going to be a showdown between Uncle Mo and boys at Toscanova. I think you've answered that by saying no. Or at least it could be, but they have questions.
That's the billing. That certainly should be. It should be billed as a showdown between Boys and Toscanova and Uncle Mo, because they're the two flashiest horses that we've seen so far. So that's what you're going to see. That's going to be the ESPN mantra, probably, is the showdown. They're both horses that broke their maidens in dynamic fashion, wide margins, big buyer speed figures, but. Doing that in a sprint maiden race does not necessarily translate into winning the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. So we'll see if it does in this scenario.
I agree. And, in my under the radar section, I often like to point out something that maybe isn't quite so obvious or something that we haven't discussed. But I felt so strongly as you did about that trip that Jay Cito had in the Norfolk Stakes. I thought it might be instructive to actually show people who missed the race. Now here's the head-on. That's Jay Cito in the blue and yellow silks, the Ahmed Zayat colors. You can see him there. This is going into the first turn. He's 4 wide. This is beautiful use of the overhead camera, at least if you're a trip handicapper. That's him. You can count the paths wide, 4 paths wide. A long shot is on the lead. He's being tracked by 4-time stakes winner JP's Gusto there in second. And Jay Cito is continuing to range up. Now we've fast forwarded to the second turn. You can see Jay Cito hasn't gotten inside any further. He's still hung out there to dry, 4 wide, going around the far turn. JP's Gusto now just getting ready to take over from the long shot as a J. Paul Redham horse there checks out. Here comes Jay Cito on the far out. Now at this point, most horses would be spent from this trip. And this is the time where on cue they will back out of it. And keep in mind, this is not some slouch that Jay Cito is running down here. This is a 4-time stakes winner in JP's Gusto, who despite a 4-wide throughout trip, Jay Cito has just run down to not just win the Norfolk Stakes, but to break his maiden. That was his first career win. His connections and jockey Mike Smith had mentioned in Del Mar that this horse was really crying out for more ground. That race seemed to prove that point. And in a race, like you said, not to echo you, but where you've got kind of brilliant, maybe precociously bred horses, one by Officer, another by Indian Charlie, who may not necessarily want to go longer, or if they do, maybe they won't do it as quickly. I was impressed by Jay Cito.
And he did it despite the sounds of the radar in the background. One other quick thing about Jay Cito, or about handicapping in general, when you just got a chance to see that great overhead shot to see exactly how wide he was. If you like to do like the Sheets guys do, for example, and you want to adjust your numbers based on how much ground they've covered, it's a good idea to use horses that run in the 2-path as sort of your benchmark. If they run in the 1-path all the way around the racetrack, subtract a little bit from their numbers. If they run in the 3 or 4 paths or wider, then you add. The 2-path is sort of the 0. It's sort of the benchmark there. And I found from looking at, I actually did a little study looking at Tracus, at Del Mar and at Keeneland. And I think the average rule of thumb that most people go on is like 1 length for every horse lane that you're out, for every path you're out. In practice, if you look at races like we just saw, and then you go back and you look at the Tracus and see their actual time, it's actually a little more than that.
More than 1 length?
It's actually more than 1 length. It's like between a length and a quarter and a length and a half if you go by what the Tracus technology tells you. So ground loss is actually even more significant maybe than sometimes we give it credit for.
So in Jaycito's case, if you want to take the liberal estimate, you could say he didn't lose 4 lengths or 3 lengths being around the turn, but more like 4.5.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Per turn.
Per turn. Yeah. All right, we're going to come back now and we're going to look at the next 3, I guess the remainder, the next 4 races on the Saturday card. Of course, we'll talk about Goldacova, we'll talk about Zenyatta, the mile, the sprint, the turf, and the classic. The big 4 coming up.